Unit 14, Social Psychology, studying the way people relate to others. One of the first aspects of social psychology concerns attitudes. Attitudes are feelings often influenced by our beliefs that predispose our reactions to objects, people, and events. Note, when we are aware of our attitudes, they are more likely to guide our actions. So the more we're aware of our attitudes, the more likely they influence our behavior. Some of these terms you're already familiar with. Mere exposure effect is the idea that familiarity breeds fondness. So repeated exposure to novel stimuli increases our liking for them. So the more often we are exposed, say even to a person, the more likely we are to develop a likeness or a fondness for that person or thing. Then we also talk about the central route versus the peripheral route to persuasion. The central route occurs when people are naturally analytical or they're involved in the issue, so they have something at stake. When issues don't engage in logical, orderly thinking, persuasion may occur through the faster peripheral route as people respond to peripheral cues or outside cues, such as endorsements by people they respect. So central route is the logical, analytical way of getting to an argument or persuading someone, and it takes longer, it's slower. The effects, though, are more thoughtful and less superficial, so it is more durable and it's more likely to influence behavior. Peripheral persuasion has to do with snap judgments. You see a celebrity inducing a product, you like that celebrity, so you go for that product, stuff like that. So those are the different things that can influence our attitudes. So do attitudes tell us about someone's behavior? There's been several studies. One is LaPierre's study. And beginning in 1930, and for the next 2 years, LaPierre traveled around the United States with a Chinese couple. It's kind of an interesting study. The Chinese couple was a young student and his wife. And they expected to encounter anti-Oriental or anti-Asian attitudes, which would make it difficult for them to find places to stay. But in the course of 10,000 miles of travel, and remember this is 1930, they were discriminated against only once, and there appeared to be no prejudice. They were given accommodation in 66 hotels, motels, and tourist homes, and they were refused at only one. So again, this is 1930. They were also served in 184 restaurants and treated with more than ordinary consideration in 72 of them. However, when each of the 251 establishments visited was sent a letter 6 months later, it was kind of interesting. They had some difference in attributes. So later, when they sent surveys to a letter basically to these establishments, to the 251 establishments that had served them in some capacity during this study, they asked them if they would accept members of the Chinese race as guests in their establishment, and 91% of the 128 which responded to the survey gave an empathetic no, said they would not, even though they had when they actually showed up, but when they were surveyed, they said no. And one establishment gave an unqualified yes. The rest said undecided, depended on the circumstances. This demonstrates the inconsistency of attitudes and behavior. So we may behave in a certain way, and that attitudes that don't agree necessarily with our attitude. So attitudes don't always influence behavior. There is some inconsistency there. With cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger, if we experience dissonance or discomfort or tension, we often bring our attitudes in line with our actions. For example, with Iraq, when there were no weapons of mass destruction found, which were why we said we went to war, some people dealt with their dissonance or their uncomfortable feelings about not having found the weapons of mass destruction, the reason why we went to war. They dealt with this dissonance by rationalizing that we still should have gone to war to liberate and oppress people or to provide humanitarian aid, things of that nature. So when we experience dissonance, we don't feel comfortable with that. So we will often rationalize the situation until our attitude and our behavior are in agreement, and this relieves the tension. So you usually will change your attitude in order to more closely match your behavior or to justify your behavior. Compliance strategies. How do we influence people to get them to do what we want? One is called the foot in the door phenomenon. And this is a tendency for people who agree to a small action to agree to another one. So in order to get people to do something, start small and build. So if you want them to do something, first you ask them to do something really small. Once they agree to that, you've got that foot in the door, and then it makes it easier for them to agree to do bigger and bigger things. Door in the face phenomenon. In this approach, marketers start by asking for a large commitment. So they start big, and when the other person refuses, they then make a smaller and more reasonable request. For example, imagine that a business owner asks you to make a large investment in a new business opportunity. After you decline the request, the business owner asks if you could at least make a small product purchase to help him out. After refusing the first offer, you might feel compelled to comply with his second appeal. Or so, say a school is doing fundraising and they ask you for a large donation up front. You refuse, so then you say, well, how about a $25 donation, something small, and they go, well, I can do that. That's the door in the face phenomenon. Norms of reciprocity is a little bit different. People are more likely to comply if they feel that the other person has already done something for them. So it's like a reciprocal relationship. We have been socialized to believe that if people extend kindness to us, then we should return the favor, particularly in Western culture. Researchers have found that the reciprocity effect is so strong that it can work even when the initial favor is uninvited or comes from someone we don't like. We don't like to feel like we owe people. We like to be reciprocal. Attribution theory tries to explain how people determine the cause of the behavior they observe. And they do this by dividing into categories. Fritz Heider was the one who came up with attribution theory. And again, it says that people either attribute other people's behavior either to their internal dispositions, they're more like their personality, or to their external situations. So a situational attribution is when we see someone doing something, we assume it's like a reaction to stress or abuse, to the situation that they're in. Dispositional attribution, this reflects, for example here, if someone acts in an aggressive way, we would attribute it to an aggressive disposition or an aggressive personality. So we attribute it to more like a personality trait in a dispositional attribution. Stable versus unstable is a little bit different. The cause of the success or failure may be either stable or unstable. If we believe the cause is stable, say poor performance on a test due to IQ, this is something that doesn't change, your low IQ wouldn't change, then the outcome is likely to be the same if we perform the same behavior on another occasion. If it is unstable, say you didn't study very hard for the test, the outcome is likely to be different on another occasion. So think of it this way. Stable is something that is attributed to a trait that doesn't change, that affects our behavior. As I said before, if you have a low IQ and do poorly on a test, the next time you take a test, your chances are you're still going to perform poorly. Unstable is something that could change the effect of the outcome of the behavior, like the amount of effort you put into your schoolwork. Depending on the level of effort each time, that could affect how you do on the assessment. This provides an example of situational and dispositional attribution of the same incident. Fundamental attribution error is pretty common. It's the idea that the tendency we have to attribute behavior to people's dispositions, and this runs especially strong in individualistic Western countries. Behavior, however, may be due to situational factors, but we tend to overly attribute it to people's dispositions. And some of these things are like the false consensus effect. This is when we overestimate how much other people share our beliefs and behaviors. Not uncommon. We also have self-serving bias. And with self-serving bias, this is people's tendency to attribute positive events to their own character, but attribute negative events to external factors. It's a common type of cognitive bias that has been extensively studied in social psychology. So the idea of something positive occurs, we're like, oh, that's because we're so great, we did such and such. If something negative occurs, we assume it's someone else's fault, or it's due to some sort of external factor. So it's a fundamental attribution error. So we are attributing it to something else in error. This one you're obviously much more familiar with, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And here you see the three different distinguishing characteristics of that. Prejudice is a mixture of beliefs, in this case called stereotypes, emotions such as hostility, envy, or fear, and predispositions to action, which is the ability to discriminate. So prejudice, usually based on stereotypes, can lead to discrimination. So they're all interrelated, and this affects an attitude that affects behavior. This is really interesting. Does perception change with race? If you look at these two pictures. If you prime people with a flashed black face rather than a flash white face, it makes them more likely to misperceive a flash tool as a gun, which is really interesting. So they had an experiment where they flashed a white face and they flashed a black face, and then each one of them had something in their hand, and it was a screwdriver. The people that were flashed the black face assumed that the screwdriver was some sort of weapon. The people that were flashed the white face did not. They perceived it as something else. And so it's really interesting. Here you show that they've changed. This is obviously on the right, the Queen of England, but they've made her African American. And so it changes the perception of what we're viewing. So race is something that social psychologists like to study in great detail. Another thing we like to look at has to do with attraction, what we find attractive. And in this picture, it's who do you like best? Which one placed an ad seeking a special lady to love and cherish forever? This was put in an ad, and they were shown these two pictures. Research suggests that the subtly feminized features convey a likable image, which people tend to associate more with committed dads than with promiscuous men. Thus, 66% of the women picked the computer-generated face, or B, in response to both of these questions. So B is the more feminized face, and what we've learned is that people with more feminized features convey a more likable image for whatever reason. So it's kind of interesting. Another area that social psychologists look at is how prejudice occurs. And there's several different phenomena that are used. Mentally, we draw a circle that defines us. Mentally, we draw a circle that defines us, which creates our in-group, and it excludes them, the out-group. Such group identifications typically promote an in-group bias or a favoring of one's own group. Prejudice may also express anger. And according to the scapegoat theory of prejudice, finding someone to blame when things go wrong can provide a target for one's anger. Following 9/11, for example, some outraged people lashed out at innocent Arab Americans about whom negative stereotypes blossomed. Another aspect is the just world phenomenon. As we noted earlier, people often justify their prejudice by blaming its victims. Bystanders, too, may blame victims by assuming the world is just and therefore people get what they deserve. In experiments, merely observing someone receive painful shocks has led many people to think less of the victim. This just world phenomenon reflects an idea we commonly teach our children, that the good is rewarded and evil is punished. From this, it is but a short leap to assume that those who succeed must be good and those who suffer must be bad.